Good morning and welcome everybody to the launch of our data-based study Beyond Merkelism, What Europeans Expect of Post-Election Germany. I'm actually very excited and look forward to this debate because I am one of the authors and I'm very interested in you ripping basically our study apart. I'm joined by an excellent panel and I introduce it to you briefly, although they are all widely known. First is Daniela Schwarzer, my former boss at the German Council on Foreign Relations, who is now working for the Open Society Foundation as Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia. To my left is Tom Nuttall, the German or Berlin correspondent of The Economist since 2018, and a huge addition to our analytic capabilities. And to my Vida, also a Germany or Berlin correspondent and working for Le Monde since 5 years. I'm thrilled to have you all with us. And last but not least, Piotr, my fantastic colleague, Piotr Buras, who is not only my fantastic colleague, but also my co-author with this study. So looking at current takes on Merkel's legacy, I think there are basically two stories that are floating around. One is Merkel as the European crisis manager, kind of patient, negotiating a compromise, keeping everybody on board, keeping basically the EU together. And the other story is basically about a German chancellor without visions, who is acting only or predominantly in the German interests, very status quo oriented, and yeah, without enough ambition to move Europe forward. I'll ask you later to which interpretation basically you lean. But first, I would like you to get a better idea what the people of Europe think about Merkel and the two stories, the two tales about Angela Merkel. So what do they think about Merkel, her legacy, and Germany's future? We have conducted a survey in 12 member states that collectively comprises more than 350 million European citizens and accounts for more than 80% of the EU's GDP. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Piotr, who will guide you through our key findings, the data, and the narrative that we have developed. Piotr.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jana, and very welcome also from my side. And before I give you a very brief presentation of the survey and its findings, let me just in a few words perhaps summarize the main argument of our paper. And in a nutshell, as Jana said, the paper tells basically two stories about Merkelism in foreign policy. And we define Merkelism, as Jana indicated, as a strategy of skillful conflict resolution and conflict avoidance, balancing between various interests, compromise building, a tendency not to take hard choices. So that's basically how we see Merkelism as a foreign policy tactics or strategy. And the first story about it is a story about its remarkable success. And it shows that Angela Merkel has managed to position Germany in the eyes of the Europeans as a unifying and trustworthy power, even as a potential leader of the European Union. And we believe that this is a very powerful legacy of her chancellorship. The second story in our paper is about the unsustainability of Merkelism beyond the Merkel era. At its core, there is a paradox. We argue that in order to fulfill the role of the EU benevolent leader, which quite many in Europe would like Berlin to perform, Germany will need to revise exactly those principles of Merkelism that made Europeans place their hopes on Germany. And we believe that telling both stories together is insofar relevant as it is more, not less Merkelism, which seems to be what many in Germany would wish for. So let me start with the success story of Merkelism, which I believe is well reflected in our survey. And if I can ask for the first slide, we asked Europeans how would they vote in a hypothetical election for the EU president in which There were two contenders, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. And what we see is that a plurality, more than 40% of the respondents across Europe would like to see Merkel in this role, where just 14% would opt for the French president. And what is even more striking, I think, is that Merkel's popularity is outweighs Macron's across different corners of the EU, as you can see on the graph, in Netherlands, but also in Spain, in Portugal, in Denmark. The support for Merkel is very strong, and for us it demonstrates that she has successfully positioned Germany as a unifying power in the EU. If we take the next slide, we see that in a number of countries, many citizens believe that Merkel's chancellorship has made a difference to the world, and that without her the world would be a less safe place today. We find this number, at least in some countries, quite significant, even if the plurality opinion in Europe, almost 40%, is that Merkel has not made a difference. Our next slide shows what we call the Merkel effect. Merkel has apparently taken away or at least significantly reduced European sphere of German dominance. We see that if asked if they think that having a German at the top of the European Commission is a good or a bad thing for Europe, only 10% of Europeans are of the opinion that it is a bad thing for Europe, and 50% of Europeans basically do not have any problem with that. And interestingly, there is no single country where the number of those being against a German at the top of the European Commission would outweigh the number of those who believe that this is a good thing. The next slide, we also asked if the Europeans trust German leadership on a number of policy files, and somewhat surprisingly we find out, because, I mean, given the widespread criticism about Germany's austerity policy, Schwarzer Null, export-based model, and so on and so forth, we found that it is exactly economy and financial policy where most Europeans would believe that Germany can defend European interests in these areas. The same is true for standing up for democracy and human rights. And it is striking that people in countries with such diverse opinions about economic policy like Spain or the Netherlands declared high levels of trust in Berlin when it comes to economic and financial issues. But the flip side of this positive image of Germany as leader of Europe is that Berlin's credibility as a potential leader in geopolitical matters, such as relations especially with great powers, is much lower across Europe. Just 1 in 5 citizens believe that Germany could lead Europe in relations with Russia, even less so in relations with China. And perhaps it is not surprising, but nevertheless important given the fundamental challenges the EU is facing here. What we found particularly interesting is the correlation between feeling European and the declared trust in Germany. And we found out that the more attached the people feel to the European identity, the more likely they are to have an optimistic or a positive view of Germany. We see here that the percentage of those who would vote for Merkel as EU president is, for example, significantly higher among these respondents than among those who reject European identity. And on the next slide, we will see a very similar picture when it comes to the perception of a German at the top of the Commission. So the bottom line is that Germany looks like a beacon of European values, European interest in the eyes of the strongest supporters of the EU project. And I think this is an interesting finding because it is both an opportunity for Germany but also a certain burden of responsibility. But the next slides shows us that there is also a bleaker picture which emerges when we asked Europeans about their perception of Germany's economic performance. And across the Soviet countries, a third of the Europeans shared the view that Germany's golden age is in the past. Significantly less of them expect it yet to come. And most importantly, this pessimism is most widespread in Germany itself. And here the majority of Germans think that the country's golden age is in the past. And the last slide, it shows that in fact the Germans themselves do not seem to be really convinced that they would be able to provide leadership for the EU, which many Europeans trust them to perform. And for example, well, while one third of the Europeans, as we see here, believe that Germany could defend European interests on defense, security policy, only 20% of the Germans share this view. And the same is true for economic and financial issues, where the self-confidence of the Germans is lower than the trust of the other Europeans in their potential to lead. So coming to the end, what is the conclusion we draw from it? And this is the second story in our paper, and which basically says that Germany has, in sum, built up credibility in the Merkel era, which would allow the country to lead European Union. But in order to meet these expectations, it will have to reinvent, adapt, clarify its positions in a number of key areas: China, on security policy, on protection of rule of law, perhaps on European fiscal rules. And the reason is both simple and fundamental. Keeping the EU united, which was the task Merkel exceeded at in her era, will of course remain an important goal in the upcoming years. But even more crucial will be the goal of defending and strengthening the European model, European values, against a number of threats, against the breakdown of rule of law foundations, geopolitical marginalization, economic downturn. And here the recipe is not more, but rather less Merkelism. But paradoxically, in fact, overcoming Merkelism would be the best way to preserve Merkel's very positive legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for summing our report up so well. And before I turn to the jury, who then can judge whether what we produced is actually interesting, I would like to turn to our audience for a second and just encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We'll have a chance to put them to the panel later. So just everything you think of, just put it in the chat and I come back to you. But first I turn to Daniela, coming back to the jury. So I would like to give you the opportunity first to comment on what you've heard and what you've read, and ask you whether you found this surprising to see this very positive image of Angela Merkel and Germany emerging.
Yes, thank you, Jana, for having me today. And I do think there's one surprise, or several, but I'll start with one in the data you have presented, and that is this positive expectation towards German leadership on economic and financial issues. If we go 10 years back in time, we were in the midst of crises in the Eurozone, banking crisis, sovereign debt crisis, and so on and so on. And Germany definitely imposed policy choices on others in the European Union, so served its own, very own self-interest of holding the Eurozone together, but at the same time was deeply criticized, in particular by Europe's South, for the kind of policies that, of course, not only Germany, but the European Commission, the IMF, and to some extent the ECB, all framed as the policy of managing those crises. And there Germany was really front and center in a role of, on the one hand, being a veto player on some policy solutions, and in particular earlier reactions, and then trying to defend the paradigm that the Eurozone was initially built on, which was one of austerity, as the South would call it, and one of rules and control over national policies. So it is, in fact, quite surprising that the data you have shown tells us that 37% of Europeans actually think this is the one policy area where Germany could take a lead. And in order to explain that, and I think you have framed it in that way already, Jana, we need to look at how the world around Europe has changed, and the extent to which now some of those questions that 10 years ago we discussed mainly within the European Union suddenly have a very deep international dimension. So obviously, when we think about those challenges, and here China comes into play, I think Europeans are deeply aware of the fact that it is now about defending a European model and European self-interest in a world that is actually weaponizing economic and financial tools against the EU. And then it is quite natural that you turn towards the largest economy and leadership of the largest country with the largest economy to expect that if this country moves into the right direction, Europe could in the end be better off. What would that mean? And that's interesting because here the conflict for the next government may come into play. In order to make the EU a stronger player in financial terms, and in order to enhance the role of the euro, we have to do internal homework, which to some extent this outgoing German government has blocked because of the difficulties on advancing with banking union. So obviously Germany was not the only one blocking, but German positions were not compatible with some others. The lack of ambition to move forward with capital markets union, all those things move onto the agenda if there is an aspiration to have someone lead Europe in financial and economic terms globally. For reasons of time, I'll leave it there, but there are many other interesting data points I'd be happy to discuss.
And maybe we come back to the question, who would be best positioned, like from the three candidates, to actually fulfill the mission you just mapped and to lead Germany in that way. But turning to Tom, do you think that's also kind of your most surprising finding or most interesting finding, or?
So I'm going to sort of flip it around a little bit and start with I think it's the last slide, the one that we still have on the screen here, which demonstrates that at least in some of the policy areas that you asked respondents about, you have this finding that Germans have less faith in their own ability to lead the rest of Europe than Europeans do, particularly on the economic and financial issues that Daniela was mentioning, as well as on defence and security. And there's kind of two things to say about that. I mean, one is a simple point that it's sort of quite striking to find the rest of Europe, to an extent, craving a degree of leadership that Germans, to an extent, appear reluctant to provide. But at the same time, I'm not particularly surprised by it. I mean, this is a very familiar idea for people who've been watching Germany and Europe for the last 10 years. It was 10 years ago that Radek Sikorski, who's then the foreign minister of Poland, said that he feared German inaction more than he feared German power. That was in the middle of the Eurozone crisis. It was, I think, 8 years ago that you had two British academics who coined this phrase, the reluctant hegemon. Which is something that we pinched for a special report that we published on Germany later that year. So this is a really familiar idea of, there's this craving inside Europe, and actually I think to an extent also outside of Europe, in places like the United States, for Germany to step up and to accept a leadership responsibility that Germans themselves feel reluctant to do. And if we sort of peer ahead, think about some of the issues that Daniela was just describing, the kind of role that Germans would have to play in advancing some of those difficult files, particularly the internal ones that have been stuck for a very long time. I have to say I'm not especially optimistic about where we might be going next. Some of our viewers probably saw the TV debate between the Chancellery candidates a couple of days ago. Not a single question on foreign policy or European policy. It has been almost entirely absent from this election campaign. Maybe that's nothing new, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot of hope that there's going to be a strong mandate for the next government to take some difficult decisions. The feeling about where the debate in Germany is going and where the next government, where the first post-Merkel government might be going, there are going to be European challenges and tests. We're going to have an early one, for example, with a discussion on the revision of the fiscal rules, the Stability and Growth Pact, whether Germany wants to have that conversation or not. But the conversation here feels like it's about a domestic industrial transformation, how we're going to manage the climate goals that recently been revised are going to be very difficult to meet in a whole range of areas from industry to transportation to renewable energy, what we're going to do about improving Germany's dismal record on digitalization. Recalibrating the relationship with China will be a crucial one, and that obviously has a really important European dimension. And I think that is going to be one of the most important things to watch about the next German government, but I'm not sure it's quite been internalized either in the political class or certainly more broadly than that, that is going to involve some pretty difficult discussions at European level as well. So my position now is sort of one of cautious skepticism, I think.
Okay. So turning to Thomas and the French perspective, basically. So were you, Thomas, disappointed to see the leadership race between Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, and Emmanuel Macron ending up with only 14% of the votes?
I was not. Thank you for the invitation. I was not disappointed. I was a little bit surprised by the fact that by the popularity of Merkel in the south of Europe, and so countries which normally are closer to France. That's the first point. Two, I asked myself what would have been the answer like 3 or 4 years ago after the election of Macron. I remember there are many examples, but the cover of the Frankfurter Allgemeine magazine, der Anführer Europas. He was the hope of some, and 4 years later, what is his image and why? And I think that's interesting. Is it because of what happened in France during the last 4 years, the yellow vest, the thing like that, which gives not a super good image of his leadership on the domestic level. First, maybe it's his style, his way to govern. He's divisive, of course. But it's also a beyond the personality. It's the question of when he was elected, like 3 months later, there was his Sorbonne speech, which of course we can all discuss, and that's the goal. But he put something on the table, which and the idea was, okay, let's talk together, and let's. His expression was rebuilding Europe. So, and 4 years later, when I see the answer in the survey, I ask myself, is it just because he's divisive, and or is it the symptom that the European doesn't want big change? And doesn't want to rebuild Europe.
Maybe we.
And I think it's the second, maybe more the second answer, and that makes me kind of pessimist.
Yeah, but maybe starting with your pessimism again and the Sorbonne speech. So Macron maybe gets a second chance, a new German government, a new partner in Berlin, at least for the first couple of months maybe, and then he faces his own election. But how hopeful, coming back to what Tom said about his, how did you call it, constructive pessimism? No, cautious
skepticism.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I don't think it's constructive.
How hopeful are you that President Macron in the Elysee will be more pleased with the answer he gets from a new German government? So is there hope for change coming from Germany?
I think there is, but I think everybody knows, or in France, or that there will probably be long negotiation for a new coalition in Germany with 3 parties, and that it will take time. And I think there is no big hope for a change, you know.
Wow, that turns into a very depressing panel with our optimistic report and our recommendations. Daniela, how hopeful are you to see kind of what you have alluded to in the very beginning, the changes, what needs to be done to see a stronger Germany on the European scene, advocating for, yeah, also a stronger Eurozone, a stronger international currency, or to make the euro a stronger international currency? Are you more hopeful than the others?
Well, much depends on the composition of the government. Yeah. And what we can say about this current coalition is that there's one party, which is the CDU, which has been consistently cautious on advancing integration in the Eurozone. That would change the logic, that would change the risk sharing, that would change financial solidarity, that would change the joint use of financial instruments, as we now see in the Recovery Fund. The SPD is not different on all accounts, but I would say there is a difference with regards to how the Social Democrats think about fiscal instruments in the Eurozone. And that's precisely a point where Germany and France potentially could meet. I'm cautious because we don't know what happens in France before the presidential elections. Macron will hold the EU presidency as of January 1st. This may still be in a situation where Germany negotiates a coalition government if things don't go easy this autumn and winter. And then if there is again a big push out of Paris, there again will not be a strong answer from Berlin. Obviously, there can't be. So much of this Franco-German agenda is not only about substance, but really is about timing and making sure you at least have a chance to get the answer or an answer at all. So, yeah, the word was briefly about Macron's leadership. I think what we can see consistently as disruptive in Franco-German co-leadership of the EU is his decision to deliver big speeches, not only on EU issues, but also, for instance, the interview he gave on NATO, which were supposed to stir up a debate and to shock to some extent, because he kind of spoke truth to institutions, that they are not functional and that a lot needs to be done. But this does not meet the German political style of really changing institutions incrementally. So I think both sides are very well advised to think through, before they make any advancement with the European agenda, how they can make it possible for the other side to answer constructively. But again, I think the main difference now compared to 5 years back is that the whole debate on the future of Europe is completely reframed by the international situation that we have. And many of the changes are structural and happen slowly over the past years, like great power competition, geoeconomics at play, the rise of China and the American quest to Europeans to position themselves. But the COVID situation has accelerated a lot of this. And so there is an opportunity to then reframe the narrative why Europe has to be strengthened and has to be deepened. But that won't happen without political will, and we'll see what happens in Berlin.
And I think we're getting actually to a very big problem here, because precisely the trust in Germany to lead on traditional foreign policy issues like bilateral relations, EU, China, EU, Russia, and the geopolitical performance more broadly is limited. So our survey has clearly shown that this is the area where Europeans trust Germany least to lead. So, and I mean, you are all strategic thinkers, so maybe I start with you, Tom. So if you were invited to brief the new Chancellor as a Brit, outsider's perspective.
Perhaps not that likely.
What could Germany do to gain more credibility when it comes to dealing with China, dealing with Russia, also the United States? How can we boost our image as foreign policy European champions?
Thank you for that simple question. I'm going to come at it at a slightly different angle and slightly bouncing off what Daniela was saying. One of the things that I think one of the reasons for, although I was expressing some pessimism before, I think there are also some grounds for optimism, one of which is that there have been subtle shifts in the internal German debate on several of the issues that we've been talking about here in recent years. And they never happen dramatically in Germany. They never happen overnight. They're always subtle. You have to sort of, your antennae have to be quite sensitive to them. But if you look at the discussion on the sort of attitude really to fiscal policy, it's changing. It's changed and it is changing. I've been quite struck, for example, by how little resistance there was to the establishment of Next Generation EU last year, including inside the Conservative Party. And of course, you ask them why, and they will say, well, it was an extraordinary situation and it was nobody's fault that the pandemic hit. All of this is true. Nevertheless, this was an extraordinary thing that was pushed through by the French and German government to relatively little resistance here. You even now hear sort of conversations bubbling below the surface about the possibility that this might turn into some sort of permanent fiscal capacity. And the idea that you could have had a conversation like that here 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, forget about it. Similarly, on this kind of on this sort of intersection between what's happening with the European economy and industry and relations with China, there's a definite German turn towards some sort of French ideas, I think, in this sphere. There was an interesting debate, I guess, a couple of years ago, a bit below the surface, when Peter Altmaier, the economy minister, put forward a paper proposing things like the state taking stakes in certain strategic industries. You know, this is the sort of thing that the Germans normally like to laugh at the French for doing. Now, it was extremely controversial, and he had to row it back. But these ideas are now in the air. Germany backs things like these, I think they're called the important projects of common interest, things like building up European capacity in battery production or hydrogen. And this is clearly related to the need to ensure that Europe is both stronger and more resilient in the face of the Chinese challenge than it has been in the past. And these sorts of things, I think, are worth paying close attention to in the German debate because they were not there to anything like the same respect 5 years ago. And to my mind, they've got a lot to do with the fact that in the German mind, certainly in the political class, China has shifted from becoming basically a customer for German exports to, in some respects, a competitor or even a rival. And I think that that's going to play a big role in driving the extent to which Germany invests in Europe in the future.
But do you think that Germany's China policy was very European lately? I mean,
so it's interesting when you talk to people when you talk to MPs from across the political spectrum about China, you get, at least I get, a strong sense that almost across the spectrum, at least of the mainstream parties, there's a sense that this relationship, the Germany-China relationship, is going to have to be recalibrated across almost every front after Merkel. And Merkel, you know, you obviously had this engagement-first policy that is there from the very start. She made all of these visits to China. She invested closely in relationships with various Chinese leaders. In my opinion, this wasn't just kind of glorified mercantilism, as some people often describe it. I think it was an attempt basically to adapt Germany to China's rise rather than trying to contain it, to ensure that China was folded into the multilateral system as far as was possible, plus, of course, to make a fair amount of money for German exporters along the way. But as one MP put it to me, this was a policy for the Hu Jintao China. This was not a policy for the Xi Jinping China. And that when she's gone, regardless of the kind of personal views of whoever's going to take over from her in the Chancellery, there is now this strong force for change coming from business, or at least some parts of business, coming from politics, coming from Germany's international partners, that is going to ensure that it's going to be irresistible to a certain extent that that relationship is going to have to be rethought, I think.
So, and this would lead maybe to more trust for the Germans to act in the European interest. Shortly also to Daniela and then to Thomas, you as a policy advisor invited in the Chancellery, first day, Chancellor Laschet or Baerbock or Scholz asked you, Mrs. Schwarzer, what can I do to boost our credibility as kind of a forefront of, a front runner of European foreign policy? How can I get more credibility?
First thing is to really think on which issues one can deliver, because much of that good reputation is frankly based on hopes and not so much on actual delivery that we just saw in the data. And if you look at the range of challenges out there, I think there are some that Europe will have more difficulty delivering on. That's the whole question of defense matters, where I believe NATO will be the stronger institution to deliver or alliance to deliver. However, Germany has a stronger role to play in both ways. Speaking about EU and the world, I think Germany has to really look at the economic side of things. We haven't discussed trade much now, but obviously that's the one competence the EU has, which to some extent can be put to the service of other foreign policy goals. Take the human rights agenda, take the climate agenda. And I think this is something where Germany needs to quickly position itself, because it does have a privileged channel to China. We know that. Mm-hmm. And for the EU to bring China on board in a triangle with the US, Germany can actually play an important role. The other area I've already spoken about, I do think there is a super important Eurozone agenda to be worked on. And my advice in that regard to the German government would be to, as quickly as possible, establish a real relationship of trust to the French side, because much of this policy field is driven by still deep misunderstandings and distrust. Mm-hmm. As we see a new leadership coming into Berlin, and also to large degree renewed parliament, there's a lot to be done so that both sides are not lost in prejudice and misunderstandings. So it would be as much on policy that I would give advice, and on as much on really building very close relationships. And really the tactical question for the next German government, depending on the moment it comes into office, is how can they be the most helpful they can to Macron's re-election, without giving up on own principles, of course. But this is a key question, not only for Germany, but for Europe as a whole. And, Macron made a bet on Europe when he first got elected. He holds the EU presidency, so at least Germany should make sure not to stand in his way, but to be helpful.
Not to stand in its way, but to be helpful. So what could be a concrete action that the new Chancellor could do vis-à-vis also Paris to show that there is a willingness, there is an investment in the relationship? Something you would advise our Chancellor?
No, it's more general, but I would say more clarity. More clarity in the, and it's also in the public opinion. I just take an example, is Nord Stream. Mm-hmm. I think nobody understands really in Germany why they should have done or on the contrary. And Merkel said it's it's a pure economic project. It's not geopolitical. It's totally wrong. It's geopolitics, Nord Stream, pure geopolitics. And I think it's a good example of something Germany does, but doesn't want to put words on the reality. And it's the same with China. Mm-hmm. We just do, it's a commercial relationship. No, it's not a commercial relationship. It's geopolitics too. So I think we need more clarity, yes, from Germany. And it can be big disagreements, but it's easier, I think, to have a partner with whom you disagree, but you know exactly
where the partner stands.
Yeah.
So no wishy-washy politics and no either or, and we don't know yet.
And I think that's one of the challenges for the next Chancellor.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to ask a question, or do you want to move on?
So I would like to open for questions from the audience, because we have 20 minutes left. But maybe a quick one?
Well, it's a very specific one. I'd be interested in the views on, we know that we have a review of the EU's fiscal rules coming up in the not too distant future. And I was struck by, Daniela, you were talking about building trust. This is a potentially very tricky issue. Mm-hmm. Macron and his government have made it very clear that in a low interest rate environment, the old rules are not fit for purpose. In Germany, not only the Conservative Party, but Olaf Scholz the other day has said he sees no reason really for a change to what we've got. This is an unavoidable discussion that's coming up. We don't know exactly when. We don't know when we're going to have a German government. But I wondered if either of these guys had any views on if that had the potential to really upset this relationship very early on.
Maybe we turn to Daniela as an expert in the Eurozone, but then I would like to open for questions.
I think it does, in particular as the French narrative, as I would expect it to evolve as of, December before the French EU presidency, will have this component of public finances, expenditure, investment, and so on and so on. And so there could be a very unlucky blend of French positions on the recovery fund, which I think in Paris is seen as a good idea, which could be extended to make sure we have investment tools on the European scale. And it's not a crazy idea, frankly, because there are very good arguments for the EU to borrow money together in the markets, which to some extent haven't really ever been discussed in Germany. This has been treated as a one-off, and we do it and we use tools that are there anyway. But there's a huge potential in this tool, which Germany has so far really pushed aside. So if Macron decides to bet on this topic, and then comes the eternal quest from Paris to relax the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. For instance, to exclude certain investments from the deficit calculation. All this doesn't go down well at all in Germany. Imagine a situation where we have complicated coalition negotiations. And not only the Christian Democrats, but also the Social Democrats, definitely the Liberals, will take quite conservative positions fiscally on those matters. And then, we have a bad mix, frankly, for a Franco-German start.
Wonderful, wonderful news. I'll treat this now as a sort of speed dating you and the audience. And I start with Thomas, and then I also give you the floor, Piotr, for a moment, because there is a question to you as well. So, Thomas, in your opinion, is there any indication of who or which country would fill the leadership void once Merkel departs? And this is from Andreas Eckhardt. So who will fill the leadership void? France?
I think Macron would like to. I think that's the difference between Merkel and Macron. Merkel is a reluctant leader of Europe, and Macron would like to be the next one. But I think, yes, probably once she has left, the people would answer it's Macron, but it wouldn't mean anything, I think, and it's not a problem.
So we have a leadership void unfilled, and Jupiter who has no followers. Okay, Piotr, Iris Kemper is asking, so we wrote so much about the end of Merkelism, or the need for the end. So Iris Kemper asked about, what about a continuation of Willy Brandt's Neue Ostpolitik? So my question goes to Piotr, since the agenda became more of a problem in Minsk, Moscow, Karabakh, Baku, and others. So what is your assessment?
I think the continuation of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik is something, which is haunting across the German political elites for a while. But I don't think this is reviving any old concepts and would be of any help. I think when it comes to German Eastern policy, especially policy towards Russia and also towards Ukraine and the rest of the continent, I think this is where Merkel calls, apart from the Nord Stream 2 disaster, which of course overshadowed her record to a large extent. She definitely did quite a good job. But I think there is, if you think of how Germany could improve its, in the eyes also of Eastern Europeans or Central Eastern Europeans, policy towards Russia and towards the East, I think there is no much scope in the bilateral relations between Russia and Germany or Russia EU. I think that we need to acknowledge, and it would be good if the German political elites also would recognize the fact that it would be an illusion to believe that we can have a considerable improvement of this relationship, but rather I think there are probably two test cases for the German policy towards Russia, and they are not in the relations with Russia, in this bilateral relationship, but rather, for example, when it comes to security policy, and this is a question of the nuclear sharing. The question which will loom large on the horizon of the German security policy debate in the upcoming years. And it would be, I think we, as Europeans, not only Central Eastern Europeans, we should expect from the new German government to give a very clear commitment to the German participation in nuclear sharing, which is something which is now somewhere, not really articulated. And there are huge doubts if some parties which are going to form their government possibly will stick to this commitment. And this is something which of course has a massive impact, will have a massive impact on the West's relationship with Russia, because it will basically, if there is no clear commitment of Germany to nuclear sharing within the NATO, it will weaken the deterrence of the whole alliance. It will also put in question the multilateral structures also Germany so strongly believes in. So this is one very important thing. And the other is also, I think, what needs a certain recalibration is the policy towards countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, especially countries of Eastern Partnership, where we at ECFR, we have come up with a proposal of a security compact for Eastern Partnership to strengthen the security dimension of this relationship. But I think this is absolutely necessary if Germany wants also to be an important player when it comes to the EU defense and security policy, strategic autonomy. This component is absolutely indispensable.
I come back to you, but I continue with my speed dating with an emphasis on the speed. Dennis Vere, I think, asks, can we expect that the next German government will assume more and better the European responsibility and defense and security? So, with your cautious optimism, hopefully, and talking about nuclear sharing, and you just wrote a brilliant piece about the consequences of Afghanistan for Germany. So, and you wrote about all this. So how hopeful are you?
I mean, if by hopeful we mean, will the next German government be prepared to execute a sort of a step change in its commitment to European security and defence in whatever form that might take, I would put myself on the pessimistic side, I think. I mean, we have seen, this is another one of those areas where there have been sort of non-trivial shifts in the last few years. I mean, Germany always gets criticised by America for not spending enough on defence, but the defence spend has gone up quickly. Germany spearheaded the response to Russia and Ukraine and so on. But I don't see in really any of the parties a serious commitment to sort of fundamentally rethink Germany's role as a security player, to think about how and why the Bundeswehr is deployed, what the lessons, I mean, the lessons from Afghanistan that you mentioned could just as easily go in the opposite direction. Yeah. All of the people who said these deployments were a terrible idea will feel completely vindicated by what's happened. So I think if you look at someone like Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the defense minister, who seems to have decided that it's her job to kind of deliver some really hard truths to German voters the whole time. It's very interesting to listen to the speeches that she makes and to see the role she's carving out for herself in the German debate. But she also, to me, looks like a very lonely figure now. She doesn't really have much support from the political establishment at all. And particularly if the CDU finds itself out of office after the next election, which is entirely possible, I don't really see much political energy to really advance that agenda.
Or to procure successor airplanes or buy armed drones or stuff like this.
Yeah, the energy just isn't there for those difficult fights.
Wonderful. Daniela, Anna Fiorillo asks, in your opinion, which of the candidates will best continue to keep Germany and Europe on the top? So who will manage best to let go Merkelism in order to preserve her legacy? So do you see any of the candidates who, for you, would be most promising in this regard?
Well, if the question is about change, then a government which has a strong green participation would be the most likely to bring change and a departure from Merkelism. Why am I saying this? First of all, because one of the key issues, and we haven't talked that much about it here, is the international climate agenda, where Europe has to play a major role. And it's about advancing commitment to basically changing policies in a number of key countries. China is one of them. But it's also about the sustainability of preparing those policies, because they are hugely divisive, both within countries and internationally. And that's really a key job where Europe has a role to play. And the Greens, I think, are quite well prepared to not only manage climate transition domestically, but also to think through the international repercussions. And then on the agenda, which we have just discussed, deeper integration of the EU in some regards, I think the Greens are most forward-leaning. Seeing them in a combination with a Social Democrat chancellor could bring some change. However, those two would not be the ones, probably, that would strengthen Europe in, in security and defense terms. So, the most likely coalition to bring deepening of Europe and a stronger role on the key future topics would then, in that regard, be a coalition with all three of them on board. But I think, what has to happen really is that other Europeans really try and engage with Germany as well, because we constantly speak about German leadership of the EU, but there are 26 others who can actually also approach the new German leadership and voice clear expectations as to which role Germany could take.
And interestingly, Annalena Baerbock is the only one who really advocates for changing the status quo, whereas Olaf Scholz and Armin Laschet compete kind of for the who best is kind of copying Merkel in a suit, which I think is quite interesting. I have a question for you, Piotr, again, asking about basically not you personally, but the view from Poland on the leadership race, and maybe also a follow-up question also raised in the chat about what we write in the paper on rule of law, kind of a stricter approach, a more principled approach coming from Germany. How is that seen, or how would that be seen in Warsaw?
I think maybe I start with the second question, because this is indeed, as we also write in the paper, one of the, I think, central challenges for the upcoming German government, because Merkel's record on that front has not been particularly impressive. Merkel was very instrumental not to let this crisis around rule of law in Europe get exacerbated, but she didn't prevent that. And what we see at the moment, we have not just in Poland, but especially in Poland and Hungary, very strong tendencies to question the primacy of the EU law, to question the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union. But we also have just seen a couple of days ago Michel Barnier holding a speech as a potential candidate of the Republican in France, basically saying the same. He was speaking the language of Jarosław Kaczynski and Viktor Orban when it comes to the primacy of the EU law. So I think this is a real, extremely dangerous threat to the EU project. And the fear in Germany has always been that any criticism coming from Berlin would only worsen the situation, basically provoke a backlash in Central Eastern Europe. And I think this worry is not well founded. I mean, this is, of course, we also see in our survey that Poland is extremely divided when it comes to the perception of Germany. Mm-hmm. So basically the supporters of the right-wing parties are those who have a most critical view of Germany in whole Europe. In the whole European Union, they are even more critical than the supporters of Salvini, Le Pen, or Fratelli d'Italia, while the supporters of the liberal part of the Polish political spectrum are most pro-German or most also pro-European, where there's a correlation between them. So I think this is But I don't think that Germany can ignore this problem any longer, or basically remain, as Merkel said in Warsaw a couple of days ago, speaking to Prime Minister Morawiecki, completely neutral and basically bet on the prolongation of dialogue and so on. I think it will not fly. And this strategy has basically come to an end.
And we have argued in our paper that there is even a mandate for Germany coming from the Europeans to defend democracy.
I think, and this is, of course, one can ask what can Germany do, but I think what is needed from Berlin today is a very strong political signal, first of all, in support of the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union. I think this is really fundamental, and I'm missing the signal from Berlin. And the second thing, which is perhaps minor, it's to put in the new coalition agreement a sentence that, for example, that Germany supports the rule of law conditionality mechanism, and it will expect from the Commission to apply it if it is necessary. So, for example, something like this, I think that would be very, very important. And
I need to stop you here. Yeah. Just like with the trial, I need to make sure that everybody gets to speak more or less the same amount of time, and I think Thomas is lacking behind. And there is one question from Mike Huskins about a red-red-green coalition in Germany, and if that could be a chance for revitalizing European politics, or if that would be seen as a risk because of some very controversial or difficult positions that the left takes. How would that be seen in France?
Probably better than here, because there is not the same history with communism and in France. So in part of the French left, I know that Die Linke is quite popular, and the way for example, the debate there was last year in Germany after the vote in Thüringen, and the equivalence between Die Linke and the AfD. Is it they had the discussion during the trial about that. I think for a French audience, it's quite bizarre, because well, it's normal. We don't have the same history with the Cold War and so. But I think this is totally hypothetic, the possibility of a red-red-green. I think Scholz would never govern with the Die Linke. He doesn't answer clearly because it's the campaign. But when what he says about NATO, it's clear that he wouldn't govern with. So
interesting. I mean, but that remains to be seen.
I think there is no risk if we.
Okay, you mean it's a hypothetical question?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So, very curious to see how that all plays out. I think it's still too early to tell and too close to call to make any concrete predictions. But before we end, I would like to come back to one of the questions that we had asked about Germany's glorious or not so glorious future. There was this one question we asked people whether Germany's golden age was basically in the past, in the present, or in the future. And I would like to ask all three of you if we would have called you to ask this question. How would you have answered, and why? Daniela.
Only Germany's golden age lies in the past, because I do believe that the problems and challenges we are facing are so substantive and so transnational that a golden future can only be a European one, very frankly. And so it's no longer just about Germany. It's about the ability to get things right in the European Union, and if not with all 27 countries, because some obviously are turning away from the joint goals and principles, then we have to work in smaller groups.
So to make Germany's golden age of the past a glorious European golden age of the future, that is the task. Wow. Tom?
I also think it's in the past, but I have a more parochial explanation, which is that Germany is an old country and is getting older extremely quickly. I find it shocking how little this is discussed in the campaign. There is a serious demographic crunch coming in this country. No politician seems to be prepared to think about it seriously, or very few of them to think about it seriously, and certainly to bring it up in the campaign. Older voters are less likely than younger ones to support the sort of politics of rupture that I think have laid behind a lot of what we've been discussing here. Less interested in risk, less interested in innovation, less interested in making sort of big steps into the future that might involve having to leave behind old verite. So I'm sorry to say that I think it's probably in the past. And for that reason, I think the idea that Germans would be prepared to make this step into the glorious European future that Daniela was describing, I'd like the idea, but I'm skeptical that this is a country that's going to be prepared to make those sorts of risks.
You really earn your repetition of this kind of not so cautious pessimism here on this panel. Thomas, and I need to ask you for a quick answer because we're actually out of time in 1 minute.
No, I totally agree with what Tom and Daniela said about, but just one point. There is something I like in what Baerbock says. It's when she says, Deutschland kann besser. I think it's a fundamental, because it's not only, because when you see how rich is this country, what it can, it's sometimes a little bit strange to see how old the infrastructure are, the school, the trains, of course the digitalization, and I think it's a keyword. With all the means and the intelligence of the people of this country can better.
Piotr, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think I have no choice than to be optimistic, and I think that indeed Deutschland kann besser, and I think what we argue in our paper is that this is this German paradox now, that German is looking back at a very successful era actually of Angela Merkel. But this model is no longer sustainable. I mean, not only of policy, but Germany needs to reinvent itself in many areas. But I wouldn't go so far to say that Germany, as we know it now, is the best of all worlds. I think, and the same is true for the economic model we have in Europe at all, in general. I think we can think of a better future. I mean, in the European Union, but also in Germany. So, and this is in the hands of the Germans to basically make a courageous step and basically step out of the shadow of its successful past.
On an optimistic note, thank you very much, dear panelists, dear co-author. Thank you for a vivid discussion. Germany can do better, or could do better if it wanted. And to find some recipes how to do that, please have a look at our latest paper and the other publications we have mentioned. Daniela has also a new book upcoming on this precise topic. Our director, Mark Leonard, has just published a book, so there's plenty to read and plenty of recommendations out there. But for now, that was it from us, and thank you very much for your patience and your interest, and have a wonderful day. Oh.